The storm came without warning, the way most terrible things do, and Josephine Grayson stood at her kitchen window watching the sky turn the color of a fresh bruise while she told herself, for the 100th time that week, that she was perfectly fine on her own. It was the autumn of 1882, deep in the hill country of southwestern Texas, where the land rolled out in great amber waves, and the nearest town of Caldera Springs sat a good 9 miles east down a rutted dirt road that turned to mud the moment rain touched it. Josephine had lived on this 40-acre parcel of dust and cedar and hard-won grazing land for 6 years now, first as a bride, then as a wife, then as the thing she never wanted to become, a widow, and a young one at that, just 28 years old with calloused hands and a set jaw, and a way of moving through her days as though grief were simply another chore she had to manage before sundown. Her husband, Thomas Grayson, had died 18 months ago. A fever, the kind that came on fast and left no room for argument. He had been 31 years old and strong as the cedar posts he used to drive into the earth by hand, and then he was gone in 4 days. The town doctor had ridden out, but there was nothing to be done, and now Thomas existed only in the framed photograph on the mantel. In the faint shape, his boots had worn into the floorboards beside the door, and in the 7-year-old boy named Samuel, who had his father's dark eyes and his father's stubborn habit of squinting into the distance, as though looking for something that hadn't arrived yet. Samuel was asleep in his room when the storm broke open that October evening, and Josephine was grateful for that. The boy worried about her enough as it was, with a seriousness that belonged to someone much older, the particular gravity that settles into a child who has watched one parent disappear and lives in quiet terror of losing the other. The thunder came first, a long rolling growl that shook the window glass in its frames, and then the lightning split the sky above the eastern ridge, and then the rain arrived all at once, not building gradually but simply present, a solid curtain of water that turned the yard into a river in under a minute. Josephine pressed her palm flat against the window glass and watched her garden beds disappear under the rush of it. She thought about the barn roof, which she had been meaning to repair since August, the section near the south corner where the boards had warped and lifted and let in a narrow strip of sky. She had patched it twice with tar paper, and twice the wind had peeled the patching back like the skin of an orange. She was still standing there, still thinking about that roof, when the knock came at the front door. It was not a polite knock. It was not a casual knock. It was the knock of someone desperate, the flat-palmed urgent kind that means the person doing it has been standing in the rain long enough that they have moved past dignity and gone directly to survival. Josephine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifted the lantern from the kitchen table and walked to the front door. She paused with her hand on the latch, the way any sensible woman alone on a rural Texas property would pause, and she said through the wood, "Who is there?" "Martin Keller, ma'am," came the answer, a voice roughened by wind and weather but clear, carrying no aggression in it, only exhaustion. "I'm not trouble. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back and she's lame and I've been walking and I'm asking, I'm not demanding, I'm asking if I might shelter in your barn tonight. I'll sleep on the ground. I don't need food. I just need out of this rain and a dry place for my horse." Josephine stood there a moment longer. In 1882, in the Texas Hill Country, you did not lightly open your door to strangers in the night. She knew that. Thomas had told her that. But she also knew the sound of a man at the end of his rope, and that was what she was hearing, and there was something in the specificity of the request, the barn, not the house, and the concern for the horse as much as for himself, that told her more about him than a letter of reference might have. She opened the door. He was soaked through to the skin, standing on her porch with water streaming from the brim of his hat in a continuous curtain, his dark coat plastered to broad shoulders, a horse standing behind him in the yard with her head down, and one foreleg cocked up off the ground in that telltale way of an injured animal. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a few years older or younger. It was hard to tell in the lantern light, with his face wet and drawn, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, and eyes that caught the lamplight and held it, a warm, steady brown that reminded Josephine, involuntarily and inconveniently, of firelight. "Thank you for answering," he said simply. "The barn is around back," she said. "There's dry hay in the far stall, and you'll find a tin of oats on the shelf above the water trough. Your horse can have as much as she needs." She paused. "There's a lantern on a hook just inside the door. Matches are in the tin box on the same shelf." He nodded, and the gratitude in that nod was not small or performative. It was the real kind, the kind that comes from someone who has been cold and wet and worried about his animal, and who has just been given exactly what he needed without being made to feel small for needing it. "I'm obliged," he said. "There's a latch on the barn door from the inside," she said. "Use it." He nodded again, and he led the limping mare around the side of the house, and Josephine stood in the doorway a moment, watching the rain slant silver in the lamplight before she closed the door and stood in her own hallway, telling herself that she had done the sensible thing, the decent thing, and that she would feel nothing further about it. She did not sleep well. It was not fear exactly. She lay in her bed and listened to the storm hammer the house and the barn and the cedar trees along the fence line, and she thought about the barn roof, and then she thought about the man sheltering beneath it, and then she felt a certain complicated irritation with herself for thinking about him at all. She had told herself, after Thomas died, that she was done with the complicated and exhausting business of caring about another person. She had Samuel, and she had the land, and she had the 40 acres she intended to keep and work and pass on to her son, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The rain did not let up until nearly 4 in the morning, when it tapered to a steady drip from the eaves and then to silence. Josephine finally slept, dreamlessly, for 3 hours. She was up again at first light because she was always up at first light, because the chickens needed feeding and the milk cow needed attending, and the list of things that required her to be upright and functional did not pause for grief or sleeplessness or the residue of a strange night. She pulled on her work dress, the blue one worn thin at the elbows, and her boots, and tied her dark hair back, and went to the kitchen to start the stove. She had the coffee on and the cornbread batter made before she looked out the back window toward the barn. He was already up there. She stopped. She stood with the ceramic mixing bowl still in her hands and watched through the glass as Martin Keller moved across the roof of her barn with the careful, sure-footed ease of a man who had spent time at height before. He had found from somewhere the tool chest she kept on the north wall of the barn, she supposed, the hammer and the nails and the cedar shingles she had bought in August and never gotten around to installing, and he was working the damaged section of the south corner, pulling the warped boards free with focused efficiency, replacing them with the new shingles, moving with the particular economy of a person who knows exactly what they are doing. Josephine set the bowl down on the counter. She stood there for a long moment, watching him work in the early gray light, and felt something shift inside her chest, something quiet and inconvenient, like a door that had been stuck for a long time easing open just a crack. It was not romantic, not yet. It was something more fundamental than that, something almost painful, the recognition that she had been carrying everything alone for so long that she had forgotten what it looked like when someone simply helped. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She carried them out across the damp yard, her boots leaving prints in the wet mud, and she stopped at the base of the barn and looked up at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. He paused, hammer in hand, and looked down at her. In the morning light she could see him properly for the first time. He was about 32, she estimated, lean-muscled and capable-looking, with dark hair that had dried a little overnight and gone slightly wavy at the temples. His face was weathered in the way of men who worked outside, with fine lines at the corners of those warm brown eyes, and there was a small scar along his jawline, pale and old, the kind that said something had happened once and had healed and been left behind. I needed to repay the shelter somehow, he said, and your roof needed fixing. I was aware that my roof needed fixing, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Yes, ma'am, I suspect you were. Come down and have some coffee before you fall off my barn and make my morning more complicated. He came down, moving with the same easy confidence descending the ladder as he had shown on the roof, and he took the cup she held out to him and wrapped both hands around it and drank without speaking for a moment, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the first thing she noticed about him that was something other than purely practical. He did not fill silence the way some people did, nervously, with chatter and noise. He simply existed in it, and somehow that made the space around him feel more settled rather than less. Your mare, she said. How is she this morning? Better than last night, he said. The shoe through clean, no damage to the hoof underneath, just some tenderness. She'll need a day or two of rest before I put weight on that foot again. He looked at her steadily. I'll move on as soon as she's fit to travel. I don't want to impose. One day is not an imposition, she heard herself say, and then immediately wondered why she had said it so easily, without the usual calculation she applied to such decisions. You can stay in the barn another night if your horse needs the time. I'll not have an animal pushed before she's ready. That's generous, he said. It's practical, she corrected, and he looked at her with a faint expression that she could not quite read, something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. Samuel appeared in the back doorway in his nightshirt at that moment, rumple-haired and squinting, looking between his mother and the stranger with the focused suspicion of a child who has made himself the guardian of whatever remains of his household. Mama, he said carefully, who is that? His name is Martin Keller, Josephine said, walking back toward the house. He sheltered in the barn last night during the storm. His horse is lame. He's going to stay one more day until she's ready to travel. Samuel considered this with the gravity of a small senator. Then he looked at Martin directly and said, Did you fix our roof? Part of it, Martin said. The south corner. It was letting in a lot of water. Samuel was quiet another moment. Papa was going to fix that. The words dropped into the morning air with the simple, devastating accuracy that only children achieve, meaning no cruelty and causing it anyway. Josephine felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one she had learned to breathe through without letting it show on her face. Martin looked at the boy with a directness that was not unkind. Well, he said simply, it's fixed now. Samuel looked at him for another long moment, then apparently reached some internal verdict because he nodded once and went back inside. Josephine stood with her back to Martin for a moment, collecting herself. Then she said, Come inside. I have cornbread batter, you might as well eat. He came inside. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, or perhaps just different, the way a room feels different when its proportions are temporarily altered by an unfamiliar presence. He sat at the table where she pointed, and he did not take his hat off until she gave him a look, and then he did, and she saw that his dark hair had a tendency to fall across his forehead in a way that he appeared to ignore entirely. He answered Samuel's questions. There were many of them, delivered in rapid succession in the way of children who have decided someone is worth interrogating with patient directness. Where was he from? Where was he going? What kind of horse did he have? Had he ever been in a fight? Had he ever been shot? Samuel, Josephine said. It's all right, Martin said, and answered Samuel honestly. That he was from Colorado originally, born in a town called Pueblo near the mountains, that he had come south looking for work, that his horse was a gray Appaloosa mare named Gray Lady who was 12 years old and had been with him 6 years, that he had been in a few fights though he was not proud of it, and that no, he had never been shot, though he had been close enough to feel the air change. Samuel processed this with great seriousness and then said, My papa died of a fever. I'm sorry to hear that, Martin said, and he said it without the uncomfortable excess of sympathy that most adults deployed, the kind that made Josephine want to leave the room. He said it simply, the way you would acknowledge something true and sad, and then he did not say anything else about it. Josephine put the cornbread on the table and sat down, and for the first time in 18 months, she ate breakfast with another adult sitting across from her. And the ordinary domesticity of it was so strange and so quietly aching that she had to keep her eyes on her plate for most of the meal. After breakfast, Martin went back to work on the roof. He had not finished. There was another section near the north eave that had a different kind of damage, boards not warped but cracked through, and he had found those on his walk along the ridgeline and was not, apparently, the kind of man who stopped at the minimum. Josephine told herself she would go about her regular work and not pay attention to the sound of his hammer, and she managed this for about 40 minutes before she found herself standing at the kitchen window again. Samuel had gone out to watch him work. She could see her son sitting on the top rail of the fence near the barn, chin in his hands, watching Martin move across the roof with the same intensity he brought to watching the creek run after a flood. There was something in the boy's posture that made her throat tighten. Samuel had not sat and watched anything like that in a very long time. He had been too busy being careful, too busy monitoring his mother's face for signs of collapse. She went out after a while with water from the well, because it was October but it was still Texas, and the sun was coming up strong now that the storm had passed, burning off the wet into a thick golden warmth. Martin came down from the roof and drank the water standing, and she noticed that he held himself with a particular stillness, not the stillness of a man guarding himself, but the stillness of a man who was simply comfortable in his own skin, and that was an unusual quality in her experience. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because she was curious and she had decided that there was nothing wrong with being curious. "Looking for work," he said. "I heard there were some ranches near the Guadalupe River hiring for the winter, helping drive cattle down from the hill pastures before the first hard freeze." "The Caldwell operation is about 12 miles southwest of here," she said. "They're a fair outfit. Rufus Caldwell doesn't cheat his hands. You know him." "I know his wife, Margaret. She came to help me after my husband died." She said it evenly as a fact. "Most people in this part of the county know each other to some degree. It's not a crowded territory." He nodded. "No," he said, "it's not." And he looked out across her land with an expression that she could not quite decipher, but that seemed to be something like appreciation or perhaps recognition, the look a person gets when a landscape speaks to some part of them that words don't reach. "Is Colorado like this?" she asked. "Different," he said. "Higher, more dramatic, I suppose, if you like your mountains. But there's something about this hill country, something that gets into you." He paused. "I've been moving for 6 years. I don't know if I've found the place where I want to stop yet." "What are you looking for?" she asked, and then felt slightly embarrassed by the directness of the question, but he did not seem to find it intrusive. Honestly, he looked at her, and for a moment the brown eyes were completely unguarded. "I'm not entirely sure I'd know it when I found it. A place that feels like it's mine, I suppose. Work that means something. People worth knowing." Josephine said nothing to that, but she felt the words land somewhere inside her with a resonance that she did not entirely understand. She turned back toward the house. "I'll make dinner at noon," she said. "You're welcome to it." He went back up to the roof. By noon he had finished what he could reach from the ladder. By noon the south corner and the north eave were sound, the cracked boards replaced, the new shingles properly seated and nailed, and the barn that had been letting in weather for months was, to the best of his ability, tight against it. Josephine went out before the meal and looked up at what he had done, tilting her head to examine the lines of the repair, and she had to admit that it was not just functional. It was done properly, with the care of someone who meant the work to last. She called him in for dinner, and Samuel claimed the seat next to Martin at the table with a confidence that would have surprised Josephine if she had not been watching the morning's fence-sitting. Martin seemed to take the boy's presence as naturally as if he had always had a 7-year-old at his elbow, answering questions without condescension, not performing patience but actually having it. "Did you ever have children?" Samuel asked at one point, the way children ask the most searching questions with the casual ease of someone inquiring about the weather. Martin was quiet for a single beat. "No," he said. "Did you ever have a wife?" "Samuel," Josephine said. "It's a fair question," Martin said, and looked at Samuel and then briefly at Josephine. "No, I never married." "How come?" "Samuel," Josephine said more firmly. "It's all right," Martin said again, though he did not answer the question this time, just offered the boy a small crooked smile and redirected the conversation toward whether Samuel had ever seen a real mountain, which sent Samuel off on an extended and enthusiastic line of questioning that carried them through the rest of the meal. After dinner, Josephine did the washing up and thought about Martin Keller with a focused and somewhat alarmed attention, the way you think about something that has caught you off guard. She thought about the roof, the simple fact of it, the way he had done the work without being asked and without making a performance of the asking. She thought about the way he spoke to Samuel without either dismissing the boy or pandering to him. She thought about what he had said about looking for a place that felt like his own, and she thought about the way his eyes had moved over her land with that unreadable expression of recognition. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a romantic one, not anymore. She had been romantic at 22 when she married Thomas, and Thomas had been a good man and she had loved him truly. But love had not saved him from the fever, and the absence of it had not killed her. And she had reconstructed herself in the 18 months since on a foundation of practicality and purpose. She did not have room for something as destabilizing as finding a stranger attractive. But she was also honest with herself, and honesty required her to acknowledge that Martin Keller was affecting her, and not just in the way that any capable adult who fixed things and was decent to her son would affect a tired woman. There was something specific about him. Something in the quality of his attention when he looked at her, as though she were not a problem to be solved or a widow to be pitied, but simply a person worth paying attention to. She found this both warming and frightening in equal measure. In the afternoon she went out to check on Gray Lady, and Martin was in the stall with the mare, crouched down examining the hoof, and he explained what he was looking at with the ease of someone who didn't assume she wouldn't understand, pointing out where the shoe had thrown, and how the tender tissue around the coronary band was already looking better with rest and the cool mud compress he had fashioned. "You know horses well," she said. "I grew up around them," he said, straightening. "My father ran a small livery in Pueblo. I was cleaning stalls before I was old enough for school and learning to shoe before I was 12. Then, why are you not doing that work?" He was quiet for a moment, running his hand along Gray Lady's neck. The mare pushed her nose into his shoulder with the easy familiarity of an animal that trusts completely. "My father died when I was 17, he said. "Creditors took the livery. I had a younger sister to look after. We were with an aunt after that, a good woman, and when my sister was old enough to manage, I left." He paused. "I've been taking work where I can find it ever since. Ranch work, fence work, a season in the copper mines in Arizona, which I would not recommend. Whatever's available. How long have you been alone?" She asked and realized as she said it that she was asking him something deeper than the biographical facts suggested. He turned and looked at her then, fully, with those steady brown eyes, and said, "Long enough that I've stopped being surprised by it." They stood on either side of the mare in the stall and looked at each other, and Josephine felt the peculiar vertigo of being truly seen, which was a thing she had not experienced in a long time. She looked away first, pressing her hand flat against Gray Lady's warm flank. "Dinner will be earlier tonight," she said. "Samuel goes to bed at 8. He nodded. "I'll check the fence line along the east pasture this afternoon if you don't mind. I noticed a section that's leaning." "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply, and went out. She stood in the barn after he left and held very still for a moment, and what she felt was not the ordinary discomfort of attraction, though that was present and undeniable. What she felt was something deeper and more alarming, the specific interior movement of a wall she had built very carefully just beginning, to shift. She had not realized how much of herself she had walled off. She had thought she was managing, and she was managing, but there is a difference between managing and living, and the difference had become apparent to her in the last 8 hours in a way that was both clarifying and faintly devastating. She went back into the house and made a pie out of the late-season peaches she had put up in July, because her hands needed something to do, and because she was not, under any circumstances, going to stand at a window watching a man fix her fence. She stood at the window watching him fix her fence. He worked with methodical care, resetting the leaning posts, retightening the wire, doing the job properly rather than just pushing the problem down the road. Samuel had gone out to help and was holding fence posts with the concentrated effort of a small boy determined to be useful, and Martin was directing him with patient specificity, telling him exactly how to brace the post and why, the kind of explaining that teaches rather than just instructs, and Josephine watched and felt the wall shift again, and told herself that she was being ridiculous. Supper that evening was different from the noon meal in a way she could not entirely define. Perhaps it was the lateness of the light, the way the October evening came down golden and long-shadowed through the kitchen windows. Perhaps it was that she had made a proper meal, beans and salt pork and the cornbread left from morning and the peach pie cooling on the windowsill. And there was something about a real meal shared in the evening that created a different kind of intimacy than a noon table did. Martin sat across from her, and they really talked, in the way adults talk when a child has been sent to wash up, and there is a temporary window of genuine conversation. And then with Samuel between them, managing the table with the charming bossiness of a child who has decided this arrangement is acceptable. They talked about the land, and the drought that had come through 2 years ago, and what it had done to the soil. They talked about cattle and the changing markets as the railheads pushed further west. They talked about the Comanche and Apache peoples, and Martin spoke about that with a directness and a recognition of complexity that she did not expect. He had worked alongside men of various nations, and had learned to see the broader injustice of what the expansion west had cost peoples who had called this land their own for generations, while also understanding the reality of the territory as it existed now, full of people like her trying simply to hold on to what they had built. "It's not a clean story," he said. "Any part of it." "No," she agreed. "It never was." Samuel fell asleep at the table, which happened approximately once a week, and Martin helped her carry him to bed without being asked, and she was grateful for this in a practical sense and furious with herself for being grateful because it made her want to cry, which was absolutely absurd. She tucked Samuel in and stood at his bedroom door for a moment looking at her son's sleeping face, the dark lashes against his cheek, the fist curled beside his face the way it had been since he was a baby, and thought, "This is what I am here for, this child and this land, and anything else is a distraction I cannot afford." She went back to the kitchen and found Martin washing the supper dishes. She stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at him. He looked up at her and said, "I hope this is all right." It seemed like the useful thing. "You did not have to," she said. "You keep saying that," he said gently, and dried his hands on the dishcloth and turned to face her. And the kitchen was small and the lantern was lit and they were alone for the first time since the morning, and Josephine felt the precariousness of the moment with every nerve she had. "I do not know what to do with you," she said, and was immediately horrified that she had said it out loud, but Martin did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, as though she had said something he understood. "I don't know what to do with this either," he said quietly. "I didn't plan it. You walked in out of a storm," she said. "I did, and you fixed my roof. Yes, and my fence. The posts were going to fall by spring." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and the steadiness in him was the most unnerving thing about him. Not unnerving in a threatening way, but in the way of something solid and real that you have not encountered in a long time, and that makes you aware of how much you have been braced against falling without anyone to brace against. "You should go get some sleep," she said. If Gray Lady is better tomorrow, you'll have a long ride to the Caldwell place." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, and picked up his hat from the peg where she had told him he could put it that morning and paused at the kitchen door. "Mrs. Grayson," he said. "Josephine," she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it. He held her gaze for a moment, and the look on his face was the look of a person trying to memorize something they are not sure they will see again. "Good night, Josephine," he said. "Good night," she said. She stood in the kitchen alone after he went out, and she pressed both hands flat against the table and stood there with her eyes closed for a long time. And what she felt was not happiness or sadness, but something underneath both of those. Something she had buried so carefully under 18 months of necessity and survival that she had almost forgotten it was there. She was not fine on her own. She was managing on her own. Those were different things. And somewhere in the course of one storm-soaked night and one long October day, Martin Keller had made that distinction impossible to ignore. She did not sleep well again. In the morning she was at the stove before the light, and she heard him in the yard and looked out, and he was at the well, drawing water with his back to the house. And she watched the way he moved in the early gray, and felt a tenderness toward him that was so sudden and so complete that it frightened her. The way a prairie fire frightens you, not because it is coming, but because you realize in that moment how dry everything has become. She had told herself she would not love anyone again because she could not survive losing anyone again, and she was beginning to understand that this was not practical self-preservation. It was just fear wearing the mask of sense. She made biscuits that morning and fried salt pork and cracked 4 eggs into the iron pan. And when Martin came in, he stopped in the doorway and said, "You didn't have to do all that." "Now you're doing it," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, a real laugh, brief and warm, and it changed his whole face, took 5 years off it and put something into his eyes that made her want to see it again. They ate breakfast with Samuel, who had clearly decided overnight that Martin was the most interesting thing that had happened since the schoolteacher had let a rattlesnake out of a jar in the classroom the previous spring, and who peppered him with an entirely new set of questions about Colorado and mountains, and whether he had ever seen a grizzly bear, which Martin had once at a significant distance, and Samuel found this completely thrilling. After breakfast, Josephine said, "I need to go into Caldera Springs today for supplies. I go every second week." She said it to the table rather than to him, and then said, "I could take you as far as the fork in the road if Gray Lady is ready." Martin looked at her and said, "How is Gray Lady looking?" They went to the barn together and examined the mare, and Josephine knew enough about horses to see that while the tenderness was better, there was still a slight hesitation in the way the animal shifted weight, the kind of thing that would be fine for another day of rest but would not thank you for being pushed into 12 miles of uneven trail. "She needs another day," Martin said. Josephine looked at the mare. Then she looked at Martin. Then she said, "Then you might as well come to town with me." She did not fully examine why she had made this offer. She was not in the habit of examining things too closely when they felt like the right thing to do. They hitched her wagon, a serviceable flatbed drawn by a steady bay gelding named Red, and Martin did the hitching with an ease that communicated considerable experience with wagons and harness, adjusting the collar in a way that Josephine noticed was exactly right, neither too loose nor too tight, and she felt the small satisfaction of watching a person do a thing properly that she appreciated for its own sake, before she remembered to feel self-conscious about noticing. Samuel rode between them on the wagon seat, with the satisfaction of a child who has negotiated a very favorable arrangement, and the 9 miles to Caldera Springs went by in the way of good company, not the pressing, desperate chatter of people trying too hard, but the easy movement between conversation and silence that happens between people who are, without deciding to be, comfortable with each other. Caldera Springs in 1882 was a proper small town, if not a large one, with a main street that had a general store, a livery, a doctor's office, a barber shop that doubled as an informal courthouse for settling disputes, a church at the eastern end, and a saloon at the western end, which the Reverend Morrison occasionally mentioned in the same breath without realizing he was helping with advertising. There was a land office and a post office combined in one building, and a small schoolhouse that Samuel attended 3 days a week, and enough people that a stranger's presence would be noted but not treated as a major civic event. Or so Josephine thought. She had forgotten, or perhaps suppressed, the particular quality of attention that a small frontier town brings to a widow who has arrived in company. She noticed the notice, you might say, in the way that Alice Pemberton outside the general store stopped her conversation mid-sentence to look at the wagon, and the way that Henry Birch at the livery greeted her warmly but greeted Martin with a measured assessment that was not hostile but was absolutely thorough, and the way that Margaret Caldwell, who happened to be in town that day, and who was a genuinely good woman who meant every kindness she expressed, came to her in the dry goods aisle of the general store and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Josephine, who is that man with you and how long has he been at the farm?" "He sheltered in my barn during the storm," Josephine said, keeping her voice even and her attention on the bolt of calico in front of her. "His horse is lame." "He's quite handsome," Margaret said, and then, seeing Josephine's expression, said, "I'm saying it as a fact, not as a criticism." "I'm not interested in his appearance," Josephine said. "You're allowed to be interested in things, Josephine," Margaret said, with a gentleness that was somehow more uncomfortable than bluntness would have been. "Thomas has been gone a year and a half. Nobody expects you to build a tomb." "I'm getting flour and calico," Josephine said, "and then I'm going home." But the conversation, such as it was, had cracked something open that she had been maintaining very carefully, and she stood in the dry goods store of Caldera Springs with her hand on a bolt of blue calico, and felt the full weight of what Margaret had said, and the full weight of what she had been telling herself for 18 months, and the particular exhaustion of carrying both. Outside the store, Martin was at the livery arranging for Gray Lady's shoe. He had explained the situation to the smithy, a steady man named Pete Oakes who had come out from Georgia 15 years ago and stayed, and Pete had looked at the hoof and confirmed Martin's assessment and said he could have the shoe fitted and the mare ready by mid-afternoon. Martin used that time to help Josephine load her supplies into the wagon, and then they walked together down the main street, while Samuel ran ahead to the candy jar at the general store counter, where old Mrs. Whitfield always kept it visible, and always pretended not to notice when a child helped themselves to a piece, while their mother was otherwise occupied. It was while they were walking that Josephine said, with more directness than she had planned, "People will talk." Martin looked at her steadily. "Does that concern you?" "I've had enough of being the object of this town's concern," she said, and there was an edge in her voice that came from a real place, from the 18 months of casseroles and careful questions, and the way people looked at her as though she were a problem they had not yet solved. "When Thomas died, they all meant well. They still mean well. But there is a certain exhausting quality to being perpetually meant well at." Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds lonely." "Yes," she said, and hated how simply true that was. They stopped at the far end of the main street where the road curved past the church, and Martin turned to look at the Guadalupe Hills to the south, where the cedar and live oak stacked up against the sky in blue-gray layers, and said, "I came into your property by accident, Josephine. The storm and the thrown shoe, I want you to know that I wasn't looking for anything. I was cold and wet and worried about my horse." "I know that," she said. "But I want you to know something else," he said, and turned to look at her, and the directness of his gaze in the October sunlight was something she had no armor against. "Something has happened in the last 2 days that I did not expect, and that I think you did not expect either, and I am not a man who is comfortable pretending things are simpler than they are." Josephine looked at him. A wagon rolled past on the main street, kicking up dust. The smell of cedar and autumn air and something warm she could not name moved between them. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that I don't want to ride to the Caldwell place and leave things unsaid, because I have a long history of leaving things unsaid and I am tired of it." He paused. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and your land is beautiful and your boy is extraordinary, and I would like to know if there is any version of the world in which it would be appropriate for me to come back." Josephine stood very still. The wind moved through the cedar trees along the church fence. Far down the street she could see Samuel's small figure emerging from the general store with what was clearly a peppermint stick. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I know enough to want to." She looked at him for a long time, this man who had walked in out of the rain and fixed her roof and done it without being asked, this man who laughed with his whole face and talked to her son without condescension and washed dishes and reset fence posts and told her the truth rather than the comfortable approximation of it. And she thought about what Margaret had said about not building a tomb. "You'd have to come back respectable," she said at last. "Not moving on in 2 weeks when the wandering takes you." "I'm tired of wandering," he said quietly. "You'd have to be honest with me," she said. "I've had one great love and I buried it, and I've spent 18 months building myself back up again, and I am not going to come undone over someone who is here for a season." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm difficult and I'm set in my ways and I work too hard and I am not warm by nature. My mother said I was born with a January temperament." "I like January," he said. There was a beat of silence and then, against all her own expectations, Josephine almost smiled. Just almost, just the small movement at the corner of her mouth that she had been fighting for a day and a half. "Get your horse shod," she said. "Come back when you've spent some time at the Caldwell place and had the chance to think clearly without the novelty of a strange property and a storm making everything feel more significant than it is." "And if I come back and it still feels significant?" he asked. "Then we'll talk," she said. She walked back toward the general store to collect Samuel, and she did not let herself look back, but she felt his eyes on her back the whole way down the street, and she did not mind. The ride home was quieter than the ride out. Samuel had achieved the particular sugar-sustained contentment of a child with a peppermint stick, and did not require conversation, and Josephine drove and watched the road and thought about Martin Keller, and about what she had said to him, and about the fact that she had said it at all, which was more significant than what she had actually said. She had opened a door. It was a careful door, a conditional door, a door with terms attached, but it was open, and the air moving through it after 18 months of sealed rooms was something close to frightening and something close to relief. Martin rode Gray Lady back to the farm that evening to collect his things and take his leave, and Samuel stood in the yard and shook his hand with the formality of a boy who has decided that handshaking is the appropriate expression of his complicated feelings, and Martin gripped the small hand seriously and said, "You were a good fence partner." "I know," Samuel said. Josephine stood on the porch and Martin turned to her and touched the brim of his hat and said, "Thank you for the barn and the meals and the company." "Thank you for the roof," she said. He held her gaze for one long moment, and then he rode south toward the Guadalupe Hills, and Josephine stood on the porch and watched him go until he was a small dark shape against the amber grass, and then until he was gone, and then she stood there a few moments longer for no practical reason she could name. "Is he coming back?" Samuel asked at her elbow. She looked down at her son. "I don't know," she said honestly. Samuel thought about this. "I hope he does," he said, and went inside. October became November in the hill country, which meant the days shortened, and the light turned that particular sharp gold that Texas manages in autumn as though in apology for the brutal summer. And the work on the farm did not pause for the season or for Josephine's interior weather, which she was managing with her usual firm practicality, and only slightly less than her usual success. She thought about Martin Keller every day. She told herself she was being ridiculous, and then she thought about him some more, and she let herself do it because she had told him the truth. She was tired of sealed rooms, and thinking about someone was not a commitment to anything. It was simply honesty about what was in her own mind. She heard from Margaret Caldwell in the third week of November. A letter arrived with the supply wagon from town, saying that a man named Martin Keller had come to work the Caldwell operation and was the finest hand they'd had in years, steady and capable and honest, and that Rufus had already told him there was permanent work if he wanted it, and that Martin had asked Margaret if she would mind conveying his regards to Josephine and to Samuel. Josephine read the letter twice and then put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers. She wrote a reply to Margaret. At the end of it, somewhat against her own plan, she wrote, "Please tell Mr. Keller that we are well and that his repair to the south corner of the barn has held through 3 good rainstorms, which is more than my own attempts managed." It was not much. It was something. She received, 2 weeks later, a note in a direct, careful handwriting that she did not recognize but recognized immediately. "I'm glad the roof is holding. I think about that barn in the rain more than is probably sensible. I think about other things about that farm more than is probably sensible. I will not press you for anything, but I wanted you to know." She held that note in her hand standing at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she wrote back, "You may come for dinner on Sunday if you can make the ride. Samuel would like to hear about the grizzly bear again. Bring it in more detail this time." She did not write what else she meant. She thought he would understand anyway. He came on a Sunday in late November, arriving at noon with his hat in his hand, and a small paper twist of horehound candy, for Samuel, and a look on his face when he saw her in the doorway that she stored away in a private place and took out when the nights were too quiet. Dinner was roast pork and sweet potatoes and cornbread, and the last of the apple preserves she'd put up in September, and Martin ate with the appreciation of a man who had been living on camp cooking for a month. And Samuel told him, in exhaustive detail, about every significant event at the Caldera Springs schoolhouse since he had last been there, and Martin listened to every word. After dinner, Josephine and Martin sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, the blue hills going purple in the distance, and the quiet between them had the quality of something earned. "Are you staying at the Caldwell place?" she asked. "For now," he said. "It's good work. Rufus is a fair man." He looked at her. "But it's 9 miles from here." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been thinking about what you said in town, about coming back respectable, not moving on in 2 weeks. I want you to know that I have thought about it seriously. And I mean it," he said simply. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I know that's easy to say. I know you have no particular reason to believe it." "I have some reason," she said. "A man who fixes a stranger's roof, unprompted at 6 in the morning after sleeping in her barn, is not generally a man who makes hollow gestures." He looked at her, and the evening light was warm on his face, and he said, very quietly, "Josephine." "Yes," she said. "I would like very much to call on you properly, with your permission, not just for Sunday dinners. I would like to court you, if that is a word you are willing to accept, and I would like to do it honestly and slowly and with full understanding that you are not a woman who will be rushed." She looked at the hills. She looked at the yard, at her garden beds, at the barn with its new shingles pale gold in the fading light. She thought about Thomas, about the photograph on the mantel, about the boots worn into the floorboards. She thought about what it meant to love someone, and about what it meant to have loved someone and lost them, and to choose, knowing full well what loss feels like, to love again. "Yes," she said, "that is a word I am willing to accept." The courting happened through the winter of 1882 into 1883, on Sunday afternoons and occasional Saturday evenings, across the 9 miles of hill country road between the Caldwell Ranch and Josephine's farm, conducted with the decorum of 2 serious people who were taking something seriously. Martin came each week without fail, through rain and cold and one early December frost that iced the road, and made the ride difficult enough that she had been sure he would not come, and he arrived at noon with frozen mud on his coat, and a calm matter-of-factness about it that told her he had not considered not coming. They talked on those visits. They talked with a fullness and an honesty that Josephine had not experienced before, not even with Thomas, who had been a good man but not particularly given to extended conversation about the interior workings of his own heart. Martin talked about his childhood in Pueblo with a directness about both the good parts and the hard parts, about his father and the livery and the years of wandering after, about the loneliness of rootlessness, and the way it accumulates over years into something that sits in your chest like a stone. She talked about her own childhood in eastern Texas, her parents who had farmed cotton and been practical and not unkind, her young woman's dreams of having her own land, her marriage to Thomas and what it had been, its goodness and its limitations, and his death. She talked about Thomas's death with Martin in a way she had not managed to talk about it with anyone. Not because she had not had opportunity, but because no one had asked about it the right way. Martin asked about it the right way, which was simply, what was it like losing him? Not how are you managing, or have you considered what you will do about the farm? Just, what was it like? What was the actual experience of it? And she told him, and something in the telling of it released a pressure she had been maintaining for a year and a half. And she did not cry, but she came close. And Martin sat across from her in her kitchen and did not try to fix it, just listened. And that was exactly right. Samuel warmed to him in the incremental but complete way that children warm to people who earn it, which is the most reliable indicator there is. By January, Samuel was waiting by the road on Sunday mornings, watching for Martin's gray mare. By February, he was showing Martin his drawings and his schoolwork with the focused pride of a child who has decided this person's opinion matters. On a Sunday in March, with the first wildflowers coming up in the fields and the cedar pollen turning the air gold, Martin arrived looking slightly different from his usual self, not nervous. Exactly, Martin was not a nervous man, but more composed than usual, which in him translated as a quality of careful intention. He waited until Samuel had gone out to the barn to see about something, and then he turned to Josephine where she stood at the kitchen counter, and he said her name. She turned. "I don't have much to offer you in practical terms," he said. "I have a good horse and a fair reputation and the willingness to work harder than most men I know. I don't have land of my own. I have some money saved, not a great deal. What I have, beyond all of that, is this: I am in love with you, and I believe I have been since approximately the moment you handed me a cup of coffee in the rain and told me to come down off your barn before I fell and made your morning complicated." Josephine stood at the counter and looked at him and felt the full weight of what was being offered to her and did not immediately speak, because she respected the moment enough to give it the proper time. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need someone to manage the farm, because I can see clearly that you do not need that. Not because Samuel needs a father, because you are more than adequate as his parent, but because I want to spend the rest of my life on this particular 40 acres of hill country Texas with you, and I want to wake up in the morning and make a life that means something with a person I love and respect, and the person I love and respect is you." She took a breath. "I have terms," she said. "I expected you would," he said, and there was the warmth in his eyes and the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that she had been cataloging since October. "This is my land," she said. "My name is on the deed, and my name stays on the deed. Thomas wanted this land to go to Samuel, and that is what will happen. Of course," he said without hesitation, "I make my own decisions about the farm. I have been doing it for 18 months, and I am good at it." "You are excellent at it," he said. "We will be partners," she said. "Not you managing things and me assisting. Partners." "That is exactly what I want," he said. "And you will talk to Samuel before this goes any further," she said. "Not ask his permission, because he is 7 years old and this is not his decision to make, but talk to him. Tell him what this means. Let him ask his questions." "I will do that right now if you tell me where he is," Martin said. She looked at him. The March light was coming through the kitchen windows and laying across the table and the floor, and the wildflowers outside were gold and blue, and Gray Lady was in the barn recovering very well from nothing because her hoof had been perfectly fine for 4 months, and Josephine thought about sealed rooms and open doors and what it meant to choose something knowing its full weight. "He's in the barn," she said. "Go talk to him." He went to the barn and she stood at the kitchen window and watched, and she could not hear what they said, but she could see the general shape of it. Martin crouching down to Samuel's level and talking with him seriously, and Samuel listening with his father's squint and his father's consideration, and then saying something, and Martin nodding, and then Samuel saying something else, apparently at some length, and Martin listening. And then they stood up together, and Samuel put his hand in Martin's in the particular way children extend trust when they have decided to, and they walked back to the house together. Samuel came into the kitchen first and stood in front of his mother and said, with an expression of deep 7-year-old gravity, he said that he's not trying to replace Papa. He said that Papa will always be Papa and that he knows that. And he said he loves you and wants to take care of us. "And what do you think about that?" she asked. Samuel thought about it for one more moment. "I think it's all right," he said. "I think Papa would think it's all right too." Josephine felt her throat close sharply, and she pulled her son against her for a moment and held him. And over his head she looked at Martin in the doorway, and he was watching them both with an expression that was too full to be called anything simple. She straightened and looked at Martin and said, "Yes." He stood very still for one breath. "Yes," she said again, more clearly. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in his and held them, and she looked up at him in the March light and felt something in herself complete itself, some circuit close that had been open and live and dangerous for 18 months, and what she felt was not loss being replaced but love being added to, a different thing entirely, and it was very specifically and very powerfully herself that she felt, not the widow or the survivor or the woman managing, but Josephine fully. In her own kitchen, with the man she had apparently begun to love the moment, she handed him coffee in the rain. They were married in May of 1883 at the Caldera Springs Church, a small ceremony because neither of them was interested in spectacle, with Margaret and Rufus Caldwell as witnesses and Samuel standing beside his mother in a new suit she had made him from the blue calico, and looking as though he had personally arranged the whole event to his satisfaction. Reverend Morrison read the words, and Martin said his clearly, and Josephine said hers without wavering. And when it was done, Martin looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and the full warmth of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for after years of not knowing its name. The reception was at the church hall, and Margaret had organized half the county, because Margaret was constitutionally unable to do anything small, and there was music from the Garza brothers who played fiddle and guitar with the particular combination of Texas and Mexico that was the real sound of the hill country, and Josephine danced with Martin and felt the solidity of him and thought with a clarity that surprised her, "I am happy." This specific, present tense, "I am happy." After they rode home in the wagon under a May sky enormous with stars, Samuel asleep between them again, and Martin drove while she leaned against his shoulder without planning to, and felt the warmth of him and the night air and the familiar smell of her own land coming up through the dark. "Well," he said quietly so as not to wake Samuel. "Well," she said. "I meant every word I said in March," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That was why I said yes." Life on the farm changed after the wedding in the way that life changes when something you have been doing alone becomes something you do with someone. Not that it becomes easy, because the land and the weather and the cattle market, and the long work of keeping a small operation viable in the hill country of Texas was not easy in 1883, and was not made easy by the addition of one more pair of hands, but it becomes different in its texture, its weight distributed differently. The silence in the evenings no longer the hollow kind, but the full kind that comes from having said what needed saying and now resting. Martin took no formal ownership of the land and asked for none. The deed remained in Josephine's name, and he told her that was right and meant it. He brought his skills and his labor and his savings, which turned out to be more than he had led her to believe, having been modest rather than dishonest. And in the first summer, they used some of it to buy 3 more head of cattle and repair the well housing, which had been on Josephine's list of necessary projects since the previous spring. He and Rufus Caldwell had worked out an arrangement by which Martin helped with the Caldwell roundups and drives in exchange for access to the Caldwell bull, which improved the quality of Josephine's small herd considerably. And this was the kind of practical cooperative arrangement that the hill country ran on, neighbor helping neighbor in the old way that made the difference between surviving and not. Samuel, for his part, moved through the change with the adaptability of a child who had decided this was acceptable and therefore made it so. He called Martin by his given name, which Martin had told him was fine, and there was between them the kind of relationship that cannot be legislated or manufactured, but only grown not father and son in the way of blood, but something adjacent to it, with its own particular character, built out of Sunday arrivals and fence posts and patient explanations and the slow accumulation of trust. Josephine watched them together sometimes in the evenings, Martin helping Samuel with his letters or listening to the boys' elaborate theories about the habits of the barn cats, and felt a gratitude so deep it had no clean edges. The photograph of Thomas remained on the mantel. Martin had never suggested it should move. One evening Samuel asked him if it bothered him, the photograph, with the directness of a child who has learned that asking directly is more efficient than wondering. Martin looked at the photograph for a moment, at the young man with dark eyes who had been here before him and had left his shape in these floors and this land, and said, "No. He was your father and he loved your mother, and this is his home and his land and his son, and none of that stops being true because I'm here now. I wouldn't want it to." Samuel processed this. "Good," he said, and went back to his letters. Josephine heard this from the kitchen doorway and went back to what she was doing and said nothing, because some moments are better honored by silence than by speech. In the November of that year, 1883, Josephine told Martin that she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning before Samuel was up, because she had wanted to tell him privately first, and she said it with the particular mixture of joy and apprehension that attends the news of a new life when you have known what it is to lose the familiar arrangement of your life entirely. Martin was very still for a moment. Then his face changed in a way she had not seen before, a complete opening of expression, all the quiet reserve simply gone, and what was underneath it was something so unguarded and so full that she felt it like a physical thing. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was the kind of man he was. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well, actually." "Are you frightened?" "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Some," he said. "And I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." She turned her hand under his and held it properly. "It will be a lot of work," she said. "Everything worth having is," he said. Samuel received the news with an expression of concentrated evaluation and then said, "I want a brother." He paused, "but a sister would be acceptable." "We'll see what we get," Josephine told him. "Can I teach him things?" Samuel asked. "If it's a brother," Josephine said. "Can I teach her things?" he said immediately. "You may teach either of them whatever you like," Martin said, and Samuel was satisfied by this and went to school. The pregnancy was not easy, because Josephine had a January temperament and her body apparently shared it, coming into the first months with a difficult energy that kept her near the kitchen and further from the fields than she was accustomed to, which was a frustration she bore with imperfect grace, and Martin managed with a patient competence that she would have found infuriating if she had not been grateful. He took over the morning barn work without comment. He fed the chickens and milked the cow and did the fence checks and the cattle rotation, and he did not do it martyr fashion, with sighs or pointed mentions, just got up before light and got it done and brought her coffee in the kitchen, where she sat with the particular misery of the first trimester and did not make a performance of the bringing. "You're annoyingly good at this," she told him one morning. At what? At doing things that need doing without needing to be noticed for doing them. Is that annoying? It makes it very hard to be irritable at you, she said. He smiled just a little and sat down across from her with his own coffee. You're allowed to be irritable at me anyway, he said. I won't take it personally. I know you won't, she said. That's part of the problem. By spring she was well again, moving through the work with her characteristic energy, and the farm in 1884 was in better shape than it had been in years, the cattle herd stronger, the fields better managed with 2 adults to work them, the barn sound, the house's various accumulated needs addressed one by one as time and money allowed. Martin had added a small addition to the east side of the house, a proper workroom with a window where she could do her preserving and her sewing without taking over the kitchen, and he had built it the same way he had fixed the roof, carefully, properly, meant to last. On a hot August afternoon in 1884, Thomas Samuel Grayson Keller was born, which was the name they had decided on together, and the hyphenation had been Josephine's idea, and Martin had not objected to it for a single second. Thomas, because Thomas Grayson had been Samuel's father and Martin's predecessor on this land, and his name deserved to continue. Samuel, because Samuel deserved the honor. Keller, because this was also Martin's son. Young Thomas, called Tom almost immediately by his brother who found the full name too formal for practical use, was born squalling and red-faced and furious in the particular way of newborns who have opinions about their situation. And the midwife, a capable woman named Clara Benitez who had delivered half the children in the county, declared him healthy and substantial, and Samuel looked at his brother with an expression of enormous seriousness and said, "Hello, Tom." Martin held his son for the first time that evening, after Josephine had slept a few hours and Clara had gone, and Josephine watched him from the bed and saw again that complete unguarded opening of his face, the full-lit expression he saved for the things that went deepest in him, and she felt such a complete and uncomplicated love for him in that moment that it almost surprised her, the cleanness of it. "He has your eyes," she said. "He has your temper," Martin said, looking down at the baby who was still making his feelings about the general situation known. "Then he'll be fine," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head, and the look between them was the look of people who have built something together and know it. And in it was everything they had not known how to say to each other in October of 1882 when he had walked up to her porch in the rain, and she had stood at her door and decided to open it. Life went forward the way life does in the hill country of Texas, with work and weather and the particular beauty of that land in every season, with the small disasters and satisfactions of farming, with the growth of a household. Samuel grew toward adolescence with his father's eyes and his mother's precision, a serious and capable boy who read everything he could find, and had a particular gift for understanding the land, its moods and its needs. Tom grew from the furious newborn into a cheerful and energetic small person who had Martin's dark hair and Josephine's iron determination, and an appetite for adventure that kept both his parents in a state of alert watchfulness. In the spring of 1887, Josephine told Martin she was expecting again, and this time she told him at supper with both boys present because Samuel was old enough now, and because there was no reason for privacy. Tom, at 2.5, did not fully understand what was being discussed, but responded to the general atmosphere of significance with enthusiasm and knocked over his milk cup, which Josephine took as an omen of exactly the right kind. They named the second child Elena Ruth Keller, born in November of 1887, and she arrived with considerably less drama than her brother, as though she had observed the family's general preference for efficiency and decided to comply. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, and from approximately the age of 3, she had a quality of watchful intelligence that reminded Josephine, with a love that had no bottom to it, of herself. Tom, who had wanted a brother and had been very clear about this, took one look at his sister and apparently revised his position entirely, appointing himself her protector with a seriousness of purpose that made Martin laugh out loud the first time he witnessed it. And Samuel's 16 now, and moving toward his own life with the quiet momentum of someone who knows exactly who he has treated a leaner with the particular tenderness of an older sibling, who understands that small children are not to be taken for granted. The years went on. The hill country went through drought and plenty in its usual alternating fashion. The cattle market shifted with the railroads and the weather and the politics of territory and state. Josephine made decisions about the land and Martin worked them through with her, and they argued sometimes with the productive heat of two strong-willed people who have decided to take each other's disagreements seriously, and resolved those arguments because neither of them was interested in anything other than what was actually right. There were losses. Clara Benitez died in the winter of 1889, a woman of 82 who had birthed generations, and who was mourned by the county with the genuine grief reserved for people who have been genuinely useful and truly kind. There were hard seasons, a drought in 1886 that dried the creek to a trickle and tested every family in the hill country. There were good seasons, too, the kind of year when the cattle are fat and the harvest is full, and the evening light on the hills fills you with a gratitude that has no adequate expression. Samuel married in 1895, a young woman named Clara, his own naming of her a coincidence, though Josephine thought of the midwife often from a family 3 valleys east, steady and sharp-minded and kind, and Josephine gave them her blessing with a full heart and the particular bittersweet satisfaction of watching your child choose well. They built a house on the eastern portion of the Grayson land, and the farm continued in a new shape, with a new generation's energy beginning to run through it. Martin, in the summer of 1895, stood at the fence line of the east pasture one evening watching the sun go down over the hills, and Josephine came to stand beside him because she had seen his shape against the evening sky and wanted to be next to it, the way she always wanted to be next to it, which was a thing she had stopped being surprised by years ago. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That October evening, the storm. What about it?" "I was 2 miles from your road," he said. "When Gray Lady threw that shoe, I could have gone a different direction and found a different shelter and you would never have known I existed." "But you didn't," she said. "But I didn't," he said. She leaned against him and felt the warmth of him, familiar now as her own hand and still specifically him, still the particular quality of Martin Keller that she had been cataloging since he first appeared on her porch, soaked and apologetic and decent. He put his arm around her and they stood together at the fence and watched the sun go down over the Guadalupe hills, and the light was long and gold, the same light it had been on every October evening since before either of them was born and would be long after both of them were gone. "I was so closed off," she said quietly. "When you came, I was managing, but I was closed off completely." "I know," he said. "You walked in anyway." "Well," he said, "I was very wet." She laughed. It was the laugh that still surprised her sometimes, the one that came from the place she had learned to open back up again, the place that had been sealed shut for 18 months, and that Martin Keller had unlocked by the simple and persistent practice of being exactly who he was. "I love you," she said, because she had learned over these years to say it when she felt it rather than storing it away for some better moment. "I love you," he said back, the same way, simply and completely. Tom came running from the direction of the barn, all of 12 years old and catastrophically energetic, shouting something about the horses having gotten into the feed room, and Martin extracted himself from her side with a long-suffering look and went to deal with the horses. And Josephine stood at the fence alone for a moment watching him go after her son with the ease of a man who has been a father in all the ways that matter for many years, and she thought about the barn roof, and the storm, and the cup of coffee in the gray morning, and the wall inside herself that had been so carefully built and so quietly dismantled. She had been fine on her own. She had managed. And then she had opened a door in the rain and found out that fine and managed were not the same as whole and truly herself, and that the difference mattered in ways she had not been able to see from the inside of her own careful fortress. The farm went on. The family went on. Caldera Springs grew a little and changed a little and stayed itself in the ways that small hill country towns stay themselves slowly, stubbornly, with a continuity that is deeper than the changes that move across its surface. New families came. Old families added new branches. The Garza brothers played at weddings and dances and funerals as they always had. In 1897, Eleanor, at 10 years old, declared with complete conviction that she intended to be a doctor, which Josephine received with perfect seriousness, telling her daughter that it would require a great deal of work and a great deal of study, and that none of it was impossible. And Martin looked at his daughter across the supper table with an expression of such particular pride that Eleanor asked him why he was looking at her like that, and he said, "Because you remind me of your mother." And Josephine, who caught the end of this exchange from the kitchen doorway, felt a warmth that moved through her from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. The barn roof, which Martin had fixed in one storm-drenched morning, and which had been properly maintained ever since, stood sound through every season, through hail and ice, and the summer thunderstorms that rolled across the Texas hill country with biblical enthusiasm. It outlasted the original patching by decades, a fact that Martin occasionally mentioned with the mild satisfaction of a craftsman who has done a job right. Samuel's first son was born in 1897, and they named him Thomas, and the name moved forward into another generation, carrying its weight of love and loss and continuance in the way that names do in families that know what they are. On the evening of their 15th anniversary, in May of 1898, Martin gave Josephine a small cedar box he had made himself, with a dovetail joint at the corners that was precise enough to make a cabinet maker envious, and inside it was a folded piece of paper on which he had written in his careful direct handwriting, "What I knew the morning I fixed your roof, though I did not have the words for it yet. This is where I belong, and below that, I still know it." Josephine held the box and read the paper twice, and then she looked at him and said, with everything she had, "So do I." Outside, the May evening was coming down warm and golden over the hill country of southwestern Texas, over the cedar and the live oak and the amber grass and the blue Guadalupe hills, over the farm that had been hers for 14 years and that was theirs now and would be Samuel's after, and his children's after that, over the barn with its sound roof and its straight fence, over the house with its kitchen window and its mantel photograph, and its addition on the east side, and its floorboards worn warm by the feet of people who had lived here and loved here and grieved here and chosen, each time choosing was possible, to stay. Martin Keller had walked in out of a storm. He had fixed the roof. And she, Josephine Grayson, widow turned wife turned woman, who had fixed something in herself, had opened a door in the rain and found what was on the other side of it, and it had been, in all the ways that mattered, everything. The stars came out over the Texas hill country in their thousands, the way they had always come out, indifferent to the small human matters below them, and indifferent also to the particular grace of two people sitting on a porch in the dark, their children's voices drifting from inside the house, the sound of the land around them quiet and alive, holding them in the exact place where they were meant to be.